All right, so you're looking at buying a house, or maybe you're thinking about it, or maybe you're under contract and you have no idea what's going on right now. A lot of questions from buyers before and during the contract. What I will talk about today is what happens when I go under contract. So you may be asking yourself, okay, what now? What checks do I write? What's the process? What if I change my mind? If I make a deposit on the earnest money, will I lose that? If the inspection report's bad. So I want to go through all of that here in the next few moments to give you kind of an understanding of what happens during the contract period. And you will thank me, because if you're familiar with this process before you go under contract, the experience will be much nicer. You're out looking for homes, maybe you're by yourself, or maybe you have your favorite realtor helping you out. You come across a home that is just the perfect fit. Now what? So your realtor or you're going to write an offer. The offer contract is a little bit different in each state, but it has a lot of similar components that we're going to cover. So you submit an offer, maybe you're going to negotiate back and forth, and the buyer and seller come to an agreement on the terms of the contract. Now what? So once you have a contract in place, you want to know that your contract has been executed. There will be a place somewhere on the form, in Texas it's at the bottom, that shows that the offer contract between the buyer and seller have been executed. This means that you are in a contract to purchase the home from the seller. Make sure before you sign that contract, you're very serious about moving forward. If you're not, it may be difficult. It may end up costing you money. Once you have an executed offer contract, you're going to write a couple of checks. So the very first check, and this is the same for pretty much each state, is an earnest money check. In Texas, this is usually about 1%. Some states have a flat fee of several $1,000s. This is basically telling the seller that you are a serious buyer and that you actually mean business. So if you're buying a house that's about $250,000, expect to write a check for $2,500. So where does that check go? Agent's not going to put it in his pocket, and you're definitely not going to have this check go to the seller. This check is going to go into what we call escrow, and I'll talk about escrow in another video. 90% of the time, the escrow is at a title company. Title company is the company that's going to open title. They're going to be paid from part of the escrow fee to do research on the title, because you want to have the peace of mind when you close on the house that the title is going to be clear, and in 6 months Uncle Billy's not going to come after his 20% that he owns of the property. So your earnest money check goes to the title company where the title holds it. Now the good news about this check is it almost always goes toward the payment of the house. So this is part of your purchasing for the house. The other good thing about this check is most of the time, if something happens during the contract period, the buyer will receive this money back. Now, how do you lose this money? Well, there's 2 stages where you can retract the offer. The first is during the inspection period or the option period. Different states call this by different names, but this is usually about 5 to 10 days, sometimes longer on bigger properties. And this gives the buyer an opportunity to hire an inspector to check out the house and make sure everything's okay. If there are too many problems, the buyer can back out without even explaining what the reason is. And at that point, the buyer will receive the earnest money. Once the buyer has gone past the option period, the only reason the buyer will be able to retract his offer is if it has something to do with the financing. Check number 2. Not every state requires this. In Texas, up until 2021, there was a second check the buyer would write called the option fee. Now, this is usually about 1/10 of 1%, and this is a separate check, and this goes straight to the seller. Now, this is a non-refundable check, basically a courtesy for the seller to take the property off the market. Now, there's nothing you can do to get this check back, and in fact, here in 2021, the laws in Texas are changing. Now the option money is actually included with the earnest money check and gets deposited at title. So first check, earnest money, about 1% of the price of the home. Second check, option, about 1/10 of the percent if it's even required at all. And then immediately, before you go any further, you're going to write a third check, and because you are almost always going to want to pay for an inspection. Now, there's some instances where you may choose not to get an inspection. That's truly the buyer's decision. The inspection is from a separate company that's paid for by the buyer. Now, the inspection is a service that is paid for by the buyer. An inspection company will come to the house, find a million things that is wrong with the home. And a lot of times it can give the buyer a certain degree of anxiety. So you want to know very clearly what you're looking for and what you're not looking for. Every house has problems. Every house has opportunities for improvement. That's actually good news because it's an opportunity for the buyer to add value to his or her home. However, what are we looking for on the inspection report? Well, I recommend to my buyers that we don't beat up the seller, that we don't nitpick every little thing on the report. Many of the things on the report are small things that can easily be addressed over time. I'm concerned for my buyer's health and financial stability. So if there's an indication that the roof's just gonna fly off next time there's a rainstorm, I'm gonna be concerned about that. I may want a new roof. I may not even want the buyer to buy that house. Foundation is another thing that we look at. Depending on how severe the foundation is, that may be something that needs to be addressed immediately. In some instances, the lender won't even lend on a house that has a poor foundation. Other things I like to look at are electrical. Are they old? Is it prone to fires? How's the plumbing? Houses built before the 1990s often have what's called galvanized plumbing, which may have a tendency to leak or burst unexpectedly. So we do like for all those things to be updated. And if not, we at least want to have an awareness of it. Once the buyer goes to the inspection report, they'll have a couple of options. They can either move forward with the purchase of the home, which is perfectly fine, or they can ask for repairs. Knowing that repairs will be a certain amount of money, they can just ask for that money either in closing costs or detract from the price of the house. So after the inspection report, buyers often have a second opportunity to renegotiate. Now, the fourth check that the buyer is going to write is for the appraisal. Now, this is actually a service that the lender is charging the buyer. You see, the lender doesn't want to fund on a house that's not worth as much as they're funding. For instance, if a buyer is buying a house for $250,000, the lender wants to know that the house is worth $250,000 or more. So the lender is going to have an appraiser go to the house and make a final judgment whether or not the house is actually worth that much. Unfortunately, most of the time the lender does charge the buyer the appraisal fee. So appraisals usually take the longest, and it's usually the quietest time of the contract period. The appraiser is going to go out to the house, look at comparables of other homes, double check the measurements of the homes, and verify whether or not the house is worth what the buyer is paying for. If so, the appraiser is going to come back and say, hey, good news, the house met appraisal, buyer can move forward and close on the house. So next thing we look for is a clear to close. Now, what happens if the appraisal comes in low? Well, you have a couple of options. If you're buying a house that's $250,000 and the appraisal comes in at $220,000, well, we may have an opportunity. A good agent's going to ask the seller to come down on the price and then bring that news to the buyer. So the buyer's either going to try to get the seller to come down on the price. Oftentimes, there's some type of compromise that takes place. But in either way, it's the buyer's decision. In fact, if the buyer wants to, they can just back out completely, because remember when we talked about not meeting funding requirements? The buyer can actually get their earnest money back at this point if it doesn't meet appraisal value. The appraisal's in, the appraisal's good. We have an inspection report. We know what needs to be done. We know what repairs are needing to be made. The next stage of the contract period is merely just a clear to close. So you wait for the title company to finish up their paperwork. You wait for the lender to finish up their paperwork. You wait for your agent to finish up their paperwork. They coordinate with each other and schedule a closing. At this point, the buyer has a very good reason to celebrate. But don't celebrate too early, because it's not closed until it closes. So you're going to get scheduled a closing day, which in most situations, the buyer and the seller will go to the title company and sign papers at different times. Now, with the way things are in the world, oftentimes the title company can either do a mobile notary or a drive-through notary. There are many different options. So just a quick recap of what happens when you're under contract. Once you have submitted an offer and negotiated, you want to know that your offer has been executed by both sides. The buyer's going to write a check for the earnest money, which is usually about 1% of the sales price of the home. That check is going to go to the title company, where it will be deposited in escrow and eventually go toward the payment of the house. Second, in some states, the buyers will write an option check for about 1/10 of 1%. The option check goes to the seller, and it's a courtesy for the seller to take the home off the market. Third, the buyer's going to order an inspection from an inspection company. The inspector's going to come out, tell you everything that's wrong with the house, and the buyer will have an opportunity to negotiate repairs, negotiate the price or closing costs, or decide to walk away from the house completely. The final check that the buyer is going to write is actually going to go to the appraisal. The lender will order the appraisal and charge the buyer for it. The appraiser is going to go out to the house and justify the cost of the house before closing. One check that I did want to mention, and this isn't always the case, in fact it's actually kind of rare, but in some situations during negotiation, the survey, the buyer will agree on it. Now most of the time the seller will have a survey. If the seller does not have a survey, oftentimes the seller will agree to pay for the survey, but in some situations, the buyer will end up paying for the survey, and that can vary in price depending on the size of the house and the size of the land. And in fact, in many states, the survey is not even required to close on the house. So check with your state and lending requirements. Hey guys, if you made it this far, congratulations. I appreciate you watching this video. Please click like below. Please click please click subscribe, and there's a notification on the side of the subscribe button. So if you click on that, anytime I release content, you'll be the first to know. Leave a comment below. What did you learn today, and what else would you like to know? Again, my name is Austin Jones. I'm here to help you grow wealth through the power of real estate.